Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. Together we dive into the world of sci-fi and science fiction. From episodes of Star Trek, Star Wars, to The Walking Dead, Resident Evil, all the hot new science fiction movies from the back doors of Marvel or DC. The Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. You'll never look at science fiction the same way again.
Sci-Fi Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. My name is Keith. I am your host for today, which is a Wednesday. It's a Wednesday when I'm recording. I don't know when you're listening. It could be your host for any particular day. You don't have to listen on Wednesdays. You can listen, any day you want. That's the glory of podcasts, right? It's like radio, but it happens anytime when you want it to. So, yeah, it's Wednesday, which means we are talking about Brave New World, which is exciting because we like this book, ? I know I personally have really been enjoying it, so no complaints on my part. I don't know how everybody else is feeling about it in particular, but I personally am a pretty big fan. I think we're somewhere in chapter 11 right now. Last I checked, the last episode ended on chapter 8 or 9. And as I mentioned before, I've never read this book. I know nothing about it. So part of the fun of me doing this podcast is me predicting and figuring things out and such. But there is a little bit of, I guess we're just going to jump right into the plot summary. There is a little bit of some intrigue that is happening currently with the whole book. We're finally getting some potential conflict. So the main character, his name starts with a B. Bernard. There we go. Bernard Marx, which last week I noticed is Karl Marx, and his companion on this particular trip is Lenina, and Lenina, and Marx. So a little bit of communism thrown in there, I would guess. I've mentioned several times before that I don't have a ton of background information on what exactly it is that Huxley believes in or advocates for as far as economic and social systems are concerned. But I can generally tell from this particular book that he generally is at least a little bit anti-capitalist. I wouldn't say completely, but the fact that the capitalist or this somewhat fully realized capitalist system, this civilization that's based completely on the teachings of Henry Ford, is in direct conflict with people named Marx and Lenina, mainly Marx, is not lost on me in any capacity. I'm more than sure that nomenclature, those names, are 100% intentional. So, yeah, Lenina and Bernard are taking a vacation on a savage reserve, and savage reserves are these small pockets of uncivilized individuals who basically live more like we live today, in comparison to how everybody lives in the civilized portion of the world. And I am using air quotes around civilized and uncivilized. I will also say this book was written in the 1920s, if I remember correctly. I've been quoting the time period in which it was made several times, but for some odd reason I just forgot. But regardless, because of that, there are some questionable or problematic words that are used. Not like the words that we would normally associate with being questionable and problematic. They're very old-timey words, if you will, that are almost never used in a modern context. But regardless, they are a little questionable. So if you are reading this book for the first time like I am, and you're not quite caught up to where I'm at, or if you haven't noticed it, I think it's interesting and funny. And also, I wouldn't be surprised if this particular book is no longer read in classrooms just because of some of the terminology it uses, which I would, in my opinion, would think is not worthy of it being removed from a potential option as something to be included in the curriculum, but that's just my opinion. And I'm also just bringing it up for some of the more sensitive people who are interested in reading the book, who might take issue or find that to be like a personal affront to them, because that's a valid contention to have in some regards with certain books in certain time periods. So regardless, they're on this reserve, and Bernard Marx and Lenina have met a woman named Linda and a boy named John. And we talked a lot about John and his kind of, I guess, upbringing last week. John is a savage, which I think is funny. His name is John, and he's the savage. It sounds, especially considering what happens later on in the book, it sounds a lot like Huxley might be referencing the story of Pocahontas with John Smith, maybe. I don't know if Pocahontas is the woman's actual name, but there was a Native American woman who supposedly fell in love with a colonist, and that colonist takes her back to Britain, and I think she gets sick and dies in the real story, but obviously in the Disney movies, things are altered quite a bit. Regardless, as are most things in Disney movies, I think that the savage's name being John, and the fact that he gets taken off of this reservation and back to the quote-unquote civilized world, I don't know if that's intentional. If it isn't intentional, it is very conveniently happenstantial, because if this book ends anything like the actual story of Pocahontas does, then John will get a disease and die. Which would be a bummer, because I kind of like, or am at least interested in the development of John's character, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. So John has kind of started talking with Marx and Lenina pretty regularly. Marx seems to have a particular interest in the boy because his father is somebody who has, visited the reservation was with the woman Linda. So I don't know that he's visited the reservation, but he was with the woman Linda in the mountains outside of the reservation at some point in the last 10 to 15 years. And then on top of that, obviously Bernard Marx has some issues with society being structured the way that it is. And part of the reason that people attribute that to him is because he was not properly decanted is the right word. But if you remember correctly, everybody in this society is born out of a test tube, or a bottle is what they call them. So his assimilation into that society is going to look a little bit different than it does for everybody else because his brain is different. But I think that that's just them, like, I don't know. I don't know if that's actually what it is that Huxley is trying to imply, is that, if you could make it so there were no anomalies within the gestational process, then everyone would be homogenous. Or if Huxley is trying to imply that there's something in the way that Marx interacts with the world that caused him to draw different conclusions than everybody else. But I think that there's definitely like some implications there that a lot more of our nature as humans comes from the nature of humanity and not from the upbringing of humanity. And so I would think that Huxley in general throughout this book is just kind of arguing that there's a lot more subconscious things going on within human beings than there are conscious things going on within human beings, and those subconscious things contribute more than anything else to the conscious actions that we make and do in the world around us. And so the fact that Marx had a bad decanting, and the fact that he is kind of the antagonist to the society that he lives in, those two things are, I think, clearly being designed to correlate with each other for Huxley, for the purposes of the book and for the purposes of Huxley's own beliefs about the world. Like I had said before, I think that he believes a lot in the idea of like subconscious conditioning, and that the nature of human beings is maybe able to be influenced by nurture even prior to our own cognizance of that influence. So then it would kind of really be like the nature of human beings, because you're shaping the nature of a human being, rather than saying like whatever. The two things are tied together intrinsically. I'm just trying to say that I think Huxley is trying to imply pretty heavily that nature is manipulatable, which would make sense again for the time period that he's writing in, as someone who's kind of like a modernist, in that modernist era. And when he's writing, nature is very much manipulatable by man, and whether or not we ought to do that is something that is becoming a part of a regular conversation between individuals the same way that it is now. It's funny for how far removed we think of ourselves from being from this novel. Like there are potentially people who were alive when this was first published. They wouldn't have read it when it was first published, because obviously they would have been tiny little babies, because they'd be 100 and some odd years old now. If you'd have to be able to live to 130 to have read this when it first came out. But regardless, we're really not that far removed from this particular point in history. So for us to think about how vastly different it ought to be, it really isn't that vastly different. It's funny when you're reading a lot of science fiction authors and they're talking about like, oh, this is what the future is going to look like. Like Blade Runner is in the year 2021, if I remember correctly, and our world doesn't look anything like that world, thankfully. And it would take us at least another like 20 to 30 years of moving in a very specific technological direction for it to look like that. I mean, shoot, Philip K. Dick's book, A Scanner Darkly, is set in 1990. So, and he was saying that they'd have like full camouflage suits by then that could basically make a person almost like not invisible, but like unrecognizable via technology, which we could probably do that if we really wanted to, but I don't necessarily know that we really want to. But regardless of that, I just think it's funny that the conversation that they would have been having, or that Huxley is having in this book, of should we be using science to manipulate nature, including the nature of human beings, the fact that that's still a conversation that we have today that's very heated, it just might have a little bit of a different topic, or the same exact topic, because I've mentioned before they have done in utero gene therapy in China, so to like manipulate the genetic structure of a baby before it was even born. I believe it was to fix a disease, not to give it blue eyes or make it over 6 feet tall. But regardless, it's still, is humans messing with nature, and Huxley's conversation that he's trying to have from this book, I think in part, or a big part of it is, should we do that? Should we manipulate nature so that it looks more and form like what we believe to be beneficial? Ultimately, I would say no, because, human beings are super flawed. As you can see in this particular book, even though they're doing it, they're not homogenous in their approach. There are outliers who advocate for other things, and, specifically in this case, Marx. But that's neither here nor there. That's kind of a little bit of a rabbit hole, which I do apologize for. So Marx is spending a lot of time with John, learning a lot about him. And there's this kind of interesting little passage where John is talking about the idea of being an outsider. And Marx really sympathizes with this, because Marx is generally acknowledged as, or generally thought of as, being an outsider. He doesn't participate in a lot of the things that everybody else participates in, and he doesn't find satisfaction when he does participate in those things. So we're going to keep talking about this right after our first quick commercial break.
Want to find out what movies to go see? Then check out the GSMC Movie Podcast. It's your ticket to the latest movies, whether it's a new blockbuster event, romantic, comedy, or action flick. This show has got it all covered. They talk some what to go see now. Don't bother. What's hot on Netflix and everything in between. That's gsmcpodcast.com/movie-podcast. When it's all about the movies, it has to be this new show. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit gsmcpodcast.com for more info.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back. We just finished going down several rabbit trails for this particular episode on Brave New World. We were primarily talking about, Huxley's beliefs on nature versus nurture, the interesting fact that we're still kind of like having the similar debates to what people would have been having at the time that this book was published, et cetera, how funny it is to read science fiction books that predict the future, but the future is currently happening for us. So I think that's pretty funny. We all have thought that was pretty funny. But regardless, we are kind of talking about what's happening in the lives of Lenina and Bernard and John the Savage. So, like I mentioned before, Bernard's taken a particular interest in John the Savage, and we find out pretty quickly that Bernard has a suspicion of who John's father is, and who the man is that was with Linda back in the day. And so Bernard contacts, is it Mustafa Mons? That's his name? I think that's his name. He's some very important director, and Bernard contacts him. Huxley doesn't tell us exactly what it is that Bernard's got cooking, but Bernard specifically mentions that it would be of particular scientific interest for them to bring John the Savage back into civilization in some form, and so ultimately, he gets permission to bring back John the Savage and Linda, because John won't go without Linda, because Linda is his mother. And John, there's some sort of instance where John gets separated from Lenina and Bernard, and so he ends up going through this little bit of like kind of sad portion of time where he goes to their house, the house that they're staying in, and sees that they've left and is kind of worried because he's enjoyed his time with them. And I think that he and Lenina slept together, not totally sure, because he asks specifically, John asks Bernard if Lenina is married, and Bernard laughs or scoffs at the idea because, well, people don't get married. If you remember, everyone belongs to everyone. So there is no such thing as marriage in this particular society. So John the Savage gets to the home, sees that they've left, or thinks that they've left, and breaks in, and then finds the suitcase, Lenina's suitcase, and he smells her perfume and opens it up and has to figure out how a zipper works, which I'm surprised that these savages, quote unquote, don't even have zippers. But I had also mentioned this specific conversation that Marx and John had about feeling alien in their own societies, where John is kind of in a sucky situation because, well, he's in a similar situation to Bernard, because Bernard couldn't live with the savages in the same way that John can't, because they're both outsiders, but neither of them can live comfortably or in a satisfactory fashion in civilization, because there's something intrinsic about their perception of the world that prevents them from being able to participate wholeheartedly in the interactions that would otherwise endear them to their quote-unquote peers in the, again, quote-unquote, civilized world. Because ultimately they kind of have a desire for some small aspect of individuality that nobody else in that society, supposedly nobody else in that society, has. It seems that the majority of people in that society have consigned themselves to buying into whatever it is that is going to get them to be able to participate in that society. So I don't really know. There hasn't been enough alternatives presented to the people who are currently in the society, in my opinion, for us to make a ruling as to whether or not it's just not within the realm of possibility for them to rebel against the systems of power above them. But I'm sure that we will very rapidly find out if that is within their power. But Bernard is successful in securing the ability to bring Linda and John the Savage back to civilization. And the travel there is pretty quick. We pretty much jump straight from the reservation to the reproduction center, is what it's called, that Marx works at. And when Marx comes back and he speaks to the director is pretty quick to make a statement that he doesn't want Bernard Marx there anymore. He kind of like calls Bernard out in front of everybody and basically says, you're not fit to participate in this particular process because you are not like properly formed, because you weren't decanted properly. And I'm going to transfer you to Iceland, where you can't bother or hinder or interfere with anybody anymore. Now, Bernard Marx is an Alpha Plus, so he has received a substantial number of benefits from the world state, I guess is what it's called. So, obviously, a lot of his livelihood is on the line here. And here's like probably the best part of the book so far, a great twist on Huxley's part. Bernard says, oh, well, if that's the case, like, I would like to make a case for myself and show you something. And he brings in Linda. And Linda remembers, of course Linda remembers, because they all look the exact same, because nobody ever ages because of the treatments that they receive regularly to prevent them from aging. You just kind of die looking like you're 30, which, if you didn't have to undergo a bunch of treatments, that doesn't sound too bad. And if your body works like you're still 30, then that sounds fine with me as well. I'm 30 now, and the prospect of my body getting not as usable as it currently is kind of sad, considering what I used to be able to do with it when I was younger. Though that could just be from lack of activity on my own part. But regardless, when you're 30, you get aches and pains and what have you. So, an eternally semi-youthful body doesn't sound too terrible. But regardless of that, and my own personal miniature midlife crisis aside, Linda is described as being like just this rotund, unattractive, detestable woman, and everyone kind of like gasps when they see her because she's just so different from how they all look. And so the fact that she used to be a part of that society, obviously not living in that society has really taken its toll, in that she actually aged like a normal person. So they're just kind of all appalled because the majority of these people in these factories would have never in a million years seen anyone that looked like Linda, or even believed that someone could look like Linda. And so Linda, runs up to the director and says, don't you remember me? She's devastated by the fact that he pretends that he doesn't and is disgusted by her, which, is more than a little sexist, but we're in the context of Huxley's book, so I kind of understand what it is that he's trying to do, even though ultimately, like, obviously focusing a lot on a woman's looks, even in this context, isn't necessarily a great look on Huxley. But regardless of that, she says, like, you made me have a baby. She kind of blames it on him, and that wording is interesting to me because, like, a lot of, or as I've mentioned before, the idea of parenthood is kind of viewed as this like lewd or incredibly disgusting and awful thing that you would potentially have to undergo if it weren't for the reproduction centers. and nobody is supposed to have children of their own accord. That's part of the reason why the savages are still considered to be savages, because they have children normally, as in via intercourse and labor. So obviously Linda, confusing. Linda is not looked upon favorably, and she says, "Here's my child." And John walks in, and everyone kind of like gets really silent because they were all laughing at Linda and the fact that she's hugging the director, and everyone gets kind of silent, and John walks in and walks right up to the director and falls on his knees and says, "Father." And like the religious implication here is pretty heavy. The fact that you would like fall on your knees in like a prostrate fashion definitely heavily implies something about God in this particular case. And if it does imply something about God, then the reaction of the director is hilarious, because he basically like turns around and walks away. Which, you know, Huxley is writing in the 1900s, so the ideas of deism are not still necessarily as in vogue as they would have been if he had been writing like 100 years previously. But deism is basically this idea that a system has been set in place by God, a watchmaker God, and then God basically washed his or its hands of the system that it had created and now exists on the outside of it, not even really as an observer, but just as like maybe a passive or a innocuous participant, if you will, so that like God doesn't really have any important interaction with, or in some cases, any interaction with the world that we live in, but God is the one that created it. That generally seems to be like a lot of intellectuals from the early 1800s, late 1700s, that was their main line of thought. So I wouldn't be surprised if Huxley is trying to, in some way, be like, you know, we go to the Judeo-Christian God and say Father, and he basically turns his back on us and says, like, nah, you're on your own, kid, or like, I don't know you, which would be kind of accurate to certain biblical depictions of the kingdom of heaven, but that usually is reserved for people who wouldn't go. That's reserved for people who haven't accepted the invitation, when you're talking about what Jesus says specifically in regards to the idea of the Father turning away. So I think that this is more of just Huxley trying to, you know, heavily imply that there is, you know, something funky going on with the idea of the Judeo-Christian God. And I really appreciate the subtlety with which he does that here. But it's funny, and something that I thought was really interesting, is that when Linda says that she's the boy's mother, people laugh and like think of it as being funny, because mother is kind of this like lewd, scatographic, I think is the word that Huxley uses, scatographic, as in like a smutty joke. It's like a fart joke, basically, of a word. But the word father is like just not even allowed to be said, which I think is really interesting, that there's that differentiation there. And I would bet that has something to do with the ideas of like Judeo-Christian belief systems being heavily legislated against, or being heavily criticized by this particular sect of people, because if we remember correctly, they are followers of Henry Ford's teachings. So the idea, and it's all based around the idea of like, efficient creation of human beings. So the idea of a father, idea of an intentional designer and creator, is something that would be like very much not accepted. So I don't necessarily think that it's just like a sexist thing that Huxley is saying, that like people will say the word mother and not freak out about it, but they can't say the word father. I think that it's him intentionally trying to heavily imply that Judeo-Christian belief structures at some point, or any kind of belief structure that's monotheistic, forgot that word for a second, is just really not allowed, because most of the monotheistic belief structures attribute fatherhood to the creating entity that they worship. So I don't know any off the top of my head that don't. So yeah. So basically that happens. And what happens after that is also kind of funny and interesting, but we are going to talk about that right after this quick commercial break.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Everybody, we are back and at it again. That's another podcast reference that is not a PG podcast, so if you got it, you got it. I'm not making the recommendation. As we were talking about before the break, it is revealed that John the Savage is in fact the son of the director that has been attempting to get Bernard Marx sent over to Iceland, which would be not desirable for Bernard because that's just not what Bernard wants. Bernard wants to be in London, I think is where he's at. Don't know why. That's just what he wants. So generally, I don't need to say generally. So what happens after they reveal everything? Everybody laughs at Bernard Marx, and Linda is, of course, devastated by the entire situation because her hope was that she would be able to, like, somewhat acclimate back into the society that she had been a part of and that she was designed to be a part of, but ultimately she is unable to do so because she's lost her youth. And that is like the specific wording that Huxley uses, which I find to be interesting in a lot of regards, because generally, I don't know, Huxley doesn't strike me as the type of person. Well, okay, so this whole society is built on this idea that everyone's supposed to fulfill certain roles, and like you're supposed to participate in certain ways, and everybody owns everybody, and all this kind of like weird Fordian mumbo jumbo. And the big thing that we get is, or the big thing that seems to be the only influencing factor about whether or not someone gets to, well, one of the things is like this idea of embarrassment or shame. So like in some regard, like I mentioned before, Linda doesn't return to society because she had a child, and that is just too embarrassing, really, for her to deal with, and for her to come back to, because like I mentioned in previous episodes, they don't have any ways to terminate pregnancy because it's been so long since anyone was actually pregnant that they don't need that technology. So I find it interesting that Linda was even able to get pregnant, but that's neither here nor there. In some ways, I think a lot of this is like thinly veiled or thickly veiled religious reference, because Linda's not supposed to be able to carry a child, and she says that she went through all of the quote-unquote rituals so that she couldn't carry a child. And I think the fact that Huxley uses the word ritual is definitely worthy of note. It seems like a lot of the things that people do in the world state are kind of like vaguely disguised religious practices. Like the way that they indoctrinate children is very similar to the way that religious groups indoctrinate children, which is very similar to the way that you indoctrinate people in general. There are like these pithy little platitudes that people repeat almost like mantras, which is another religious thing from a more like Eastern religious standpoint. But also, like, we all know those Judeo-Christian people, Catholic people, whatever, who will incessantly quote the Bible in conversation. And like Lenina is able to list off like 4 or 5 kind of like pithy, banal platitudes that are supposed to assist with your ability to like cope with the world around you. And so the fact that she's doing that, to me, says basically shows that Huxley is kind of trying to say, like, look how similar these things are. Like, it's a very Nietzschean take on religion, where he's basically saying, look at the result of this like actualized form of society that basically says that people are like a product that can be reproduced, and look what they still do. They still do this thing that's like utterly meaningless, which is quote these banal platitudes that only function as like self-serving assurances, I guess, as to why things are, going a certain way, or what you should do in order to like make sure that things continue in a certain way. It's kind of like how Nietzsche would say, whenever you talk about heaven, you're basically saying that your life on earth doesn't matter, because it's this quasi form of nihilism, or this quasi nihilistic idea. And so Huxley is saying kind of like, I think he's saying a similar thing, where it's like, well, whenever you just talk about, oh, well, this is the state, like this is the thing that we do for the state, you're kind of basically removing the idea of self from the equation. You're basically just saying, well, I am the state. I participate in the way the state tells me to. You're passing the buck, as it were, of impetus from yourself to the state, or you're passing the responsibility for your feelings, or the validity of your feelings of individuality, from yourself onto the general like collective, which, as we've talked about with Hyperion, part of Dan Simmons' claim is that God is created by the collective consciousness of human beings. So in some way, Huxley's kind of lining up with that idea by saying, like, if you just kind of surrender your will to the will of the group, then ultimately you can kind of like stave off or create this thing that's going to make you feel better about yourself and about the conditions of your existence. And I find that to be really interesting, that Huxley is kind of able to maneuver in that space. So ultimately, all that to say that the director decides to resign and apparently never steps foot in the reproduction facility again. I haven't really been able to tell exactly the point of view that this novel is being narrated from, because it seems pretty third-person omniscient, and that would be like your standard narration style for like the time period in which Huxley is writing. Most modernists are very big on like the third person, unless you're talking about like Faulkner, of course, who's like the OG stream of consciousness guy. I'm sure that there were other people before him, but I don't know if Faulkner falls into the modernist movement. I would guess he does. I think he's writing around the same time as Huxley. I could also just be completely talking out of my butt to try and make myself sound smarter and not knowing anything. But I am talking about this book, so I'm not going to pause to Google that. So if I'm wrong, just at me in the comments, and I apologize in advance. But regardless, I think that it's mostly third person, so it's hard to tell exactly like what part is like temporal to the specific existence of Bernard and John the Savage in this context, and which parts are like universal and go beyond that. So the director resigns, which I find to be interesting. It's just interesting to me, like the fact that the director could even claim that Bernard couldn't be a part of this particular reproductive facility and ought to get sent to Iceland. Like, the way that this society works seems to be semi-inconsistent, which I take a little bit of frustration with because it seems like it's really absolute. But there's kind of this, like, I don't know. I have this gut feeling in this book that, like, part of Huxley's critique is going to be that, like, the collective perception of everyone is that everyone thinks in this specific way, but if you were to actually ask how everyone thinks, that's not how they think. So the collective perception of God, or the collective perception of the state in this case, is really a facsimile. It is a perpetuated idea of normalcy that I think Huxley is going to critique. And like that, you know, we talk about cognitive distance and things like that. That particular critique is something that I think that we really ought to take into mind, or keep in mind, or take to heart, because the same way in which this society works, by saying everybody thinks like this, so you should too, is kind of how normalcy works within our own contexts. In my opinion, the idea of normalcy doesn't come from what is actually normal. It comes from the collective perception of everybody believing that it is normal. So it's not that, like, the nuclear family, quote unquote, in the 50s was actually the normal. It's that everybody believed that it was the normal, and so it may have been able to become the normal. Normal doesn't arise, in my opinion, from, like, what is actually like organic and normal, right? I don't think that an organic normal exists, in my opinion. I think that for the most part, normal is a synthesized perception of normal. So what, you know, the nuclear family becoming a normal, like I mentioned before, is because a bunch of people believed that it is normal. So it's what I'm obligated to do. Therefore, I will act within what I'm obligated to do so that I can gain, I don't know, social capital or what have you. Like, I mean, really, you pick your poison here. But generally, overall, I guess what I'm trying to say is that, like, we believe things to be normal based off of certain indicating factors, and then our brain tells us through confirmation bias that that is in fact normal, and that is how we ought to act. But the reality is that normal is just what we believe other people think about us. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the statement, but a lot of people will say, I am not who I think I am, and I am not who you think I am. I am who I think that you think I am. And I think that that's exactly what it is that Huxley is going to say about society and the idea of normalcy. And it's in fact what I'm saying about society and the idea of normalcy, in that normalcy is not what we perceive as normal, and it's not what we think other people perceive as normal. It's what we think other people think about us thinking about what's normal. So, like, it's kind of like the idea of keeping up with the Joneses, but in this really circular way. We believe that the Joneses are looking at us and will think this thing of us, so we will act in this way to make the Joneses think this thing of us. It's kind of like constantly deflecting the responsibility of identity from thinking about things yourself to thinking about how other people think about the things that you think about. And that's kind of what it is that's happened in this society, in my opinion. So I think that there are probably a lot more detractors than we're being led on to believe in this society. And it's not just the Savages or John the Savage or even just Bernard. I think that there are generally a lot of dissatisfied individuals who are just going along with the way that things are because they believe that that's what they're supposed to do, because they believe that if they believe that, other people will value them. And that's kind of what it is. It's this constant search for finding value that has been kind of mitigated, or I guess placed on the value of efficiency. So if I can be efficient, if I can be a part of this larger thing than myself that is God but isn't God, then I can become valuable. And for some odd reason, we have an evolutionary desire, or a human intrinsic desire, to be considered valuable by the people around us. So, yeah. We're going to keep talking about that, as well as the rest of what happens in these few chapters, right after this last quick commercial break.
Watching TV has changed over time. Streaming has become the new norm. That's why Golden State Media Concepts television podcast dives headfirst to the world of cord cutting. Want to be on the loop of what's hot in Netflix? Or if it's not a preference, what about original shows in Hulu? We've got you covered. Join us as we fill in the blanks and talk about movies to stream and what show you should be binging. This is the Golden State Media Concepts television podcast.
Everybody, that was our last commercial break for this particular episode. So before the break, we were kind of talking about just like the society that is happening in Brave New World, as well as like the heavily religiously weighted, I don't know. Substantially religiously weighted. So many adverbs. Language that is being used by Huxley to describe different aspects of this world. One of the main things that he talks about is this idea, or one of the things that I brought up specifically was the idea that like rituals and banal platitudes and like quotation and things like that, all of these behaviors that seem to be pretty akin to or similar to what we would associate with like the behavior of religious individuals. So it's pretty obvious to me that there is like a pretty heavy religious theme going on here, where they just Huxley is kind of trying to imply a lot of things about religion and government and how they can be very easily conflated or combined to kind of create like a specific type of environment or a specific type of individual, and how kind of like, I would argue that he's kind of making the statement that these things are dangerous together. I'm not entirely sure how I would support that completely, but basically I would say that his idea is that individuals who participate in certain groups of people who participate in these things can very easily become consumed by what their perception of the thing is, or really what their perception of everyone else's perception of the thing is. So like, you know, people don't speak up in religious groups about things that are, you know, wrong or things that they disagree with because they feel that they're wrong about those things. They don't speak up or say anything because they feel that other people will think that they're wrong. So it's just kind of this like constant deferment of identity, constant deferment of responsibility that seems to be pretty, I guess, pervasive throughout the general experience of humankind. Now, I don't want to claim any psychological studies that prove this because psychology is currently experiencing a pretty bad replication crisis, which I think I've mentioned before. But basically what that means is that the people who do clinical studies in psychology have had a lot of trouble replicating the results of previous studies. One great example is, of course, the Stanford prison experiment, which a lot of people have, you know, quoted or used in their doctoral thesis or what have you. But like, no one has been able to replicate those results. And now the part of the reason they can't replicate them is because ultimately that test was kind of rigged. So it's really impossible to get a good read on or to replicate those results, or even to say that those results are worthy of note, because again, that was mostly a staged experiment. So there really wasn't much that we learned about human nature from that. We just learned that human nature can be manipulated to make it, or to make it so that you can say what you want about it if you know, can predict certain factors. But there is this general idea, there is a social psychology theory that says that people will defer responsibility to act onto other people pretty much ad nauseum. And I think that that's, kind of similar to what happens in ideal systems, or systems based on ideological systems. There we go. That's the word I'm looking for. But regardless, back to the story. So we find out that John Smith is the son of the director, and Linda is the director's former lover. Everyone freaks out because John says Linda is his mother, and then he says that the director is his father. The father is so embarrassed he resigns, and Linda is so devastated that she basically just ends up on a constant soma drip. They call it a soma holiday. And what we find out about soma is that, yes, it's exactly like alcohol in the sense that it can remove you from experiencing the world around you, so you're kind of like out of body when you're experiencing most things. And you can kind of live in this delusional world, and there's no hangover, there's no negative consequences that you feel immediately, but that it will eventually just kill you. So you'll be in the middle of a soma high, and your lungs will give out, and you'll just suffocate to death. But you'll be so high that you won't know that you are, so it's painless. And there's kind of this discussion, because John is very upset by the fact that his mother... he calls her Linda, but because she doesn't want to be called mother. But he's upset by this because she's kind of checked out from reality and isn't engaging in anything that he's engaging in, because, Bernard Marx is taking him around and showing John the Savage everything about this civilized world, quote unquote. John the Savage keeps on saying, "Brave new world," like as an exclamation. I think that that's kind of just like, I don't know. I'm not as familiar with the turn of phrase as I ought to be. I should look up the etymology of it, but I haven't done so yet. Regardless, he's kind of alone in this. He's just stuck with Marx, and Marx is kind of like he's only able to relate to him a little bit. And I think that there's obviously going to be some sort of love story that happens between John and Lenina. But regardless of that, he is upset, and one of the doctors kind of assuages his I don't know. He complains that soma will kill Linda, and he says, soma takes away her time. And the doctor says, no, soma actually gives her all the time in the world, because she's basically living in a virtual reality, a chemically induced virtual reality in which she doesn't have to interact with the real world or real time. So in her mind, she could be 20 again and hallucinating that she's on a beach. And she could be on that beach for months in the span of a day. Basically, the only thing that limits your amount of time when it comes to being high on soma is how fast you can perceive things. And obviously, we know the brain as far as compared to computer function, our brain is able to do substantially more. A computer can barely upload a WAV file to the internet while doing something else, yet somehow our body manages like all of the cells and all of our cellular division and heartbeat and respiratory and cognitive function and all at the same time usually without any kind of slowing down in CPU, if you will. So, there's some argument to be made that if you fast, you can think a little bit better, because your blood is not being diverted to digestion. But I'm not going to contribute to I'm not going to attribute higher cognitive function to not eating. I personally have experienced some interesting, effects of fasting. So I do recommend intermittent fasting, at least occasionally as a practice, but generally I'm not going to speak to its efficacy to increasing your actual comprehension power, if you will. But John is kind of assuaged in his feelings of guilt or feelings of anger, but he still isn't satisfied with the fact that ultimately Linda's just going to spend the rest of her days on a couch drowning herself in soma rather than in alcohol. And we can see that there's a lot of care that happens from John towards his mother that other individuals just don't understand in this society, because, of course, they don't have parents. And I am curious as to whether or not there's going to be any type of care from John towards his father. If I had to guess, there is more likely to be care from John's father to John, just because that seems to be a kind of standard trope, is that the son desires the mother, and not the father, but the father desires the son. even though the son doesn't desire him. So there's this like tragic rejection type thing that happens that people seem to like to write about. But I'm not sure completely. That's, I'm not going to say that's neither here nor there. That's like my catchphrase. But among many other things, such as if you remember correctly, I say that very frequently on here, and I do apologize for it. Regardless, just kind of some of the things that John has been experiencing and what his reactions to them. So the next chapter or in this chapter where we learn about what's happening to Linda, John is kind of like traveling around to different facilities within London. He goes to the reproduction facility and gets a tour and ends up getting sick and throwing up in the corner, which is interesting because he is nonplussed about a lot of the technologies that he sees. So like flying very quickly, or transportation that moves at a ridiculous speed, or like therapy so you can look young forever. Those things don't seem to impress him because he has this idea of like a transcendental soul, is what Marx says. But the idea that everybody's getting made out of jars and that there's all these like twins running around really upsets him, to the point of him being physically ill and asking specifically when he goes places like, are there a lot of twins here? I think that the social hierarchy that's created by the genetic manipulation of human fetuses is something that really upsets John because of the society that he grew up in, but also because of its juxtaposition to the way in which he was born or created. So I think that that's interesting and worthy of note. The last thing I'm going to kind of say before we end our episode today, we are getting a lot of this information now from first person, which is why I was mentioning that I was kind of semi-confused about who's narrating. Because at this point, it's revealed to us that Mustafa Mons is reading reports from Bernard about John the Savage, because I'm pretty sure Mons is the one who said that John the Savage could come into society, and he gave Bernard the permission to bring him back, specifically because he knew that John was the offspring of the director, which would mean that John probably is like Alpha Plus or above. So it'd be the same social tier as Marx. But I just find it interesting that... Sorry, no, I got kind of off track there. But Mustafa Mons seems to be getting some critique from Bernard Marx about the structures that people are living in, and doesn't even want to entertain the idea that Marx has any like valuable critique of the fact that the social hierarchies exist in the way that they do. And in addition to that, Marx is not writing the full word mother. He's writing M-, and Mustafa Mons kind of takes offense to this. So it seems that Bernard Marx has a tendency to rub people the wrong way, especially the people above him. So I am really interested to see what it is exactly that happens with Marx. I'm not so sure that Marx is going to be a permanent character in this story. I wouldn't be surprised if we shift our focus from Marx to primarily John the Savage, and kind of get more of John's perspective on things, or a third-person omniscient perspective observing John, and Bernard gets shipped off somewhere or kind of removed from the equation because of his odd proclivities for, I guess, rebelliousness would be the general term. I'm not totally sure. I would guess there might be like a love triangle that forms in some regard, but it doesn't seem like Marx is really interested in Lenina anymore in any particular regard. He starts bragging about his ability to have women, and as I've mentioned before on the podcast, having women is intercourse, and women have men as well, so it's equal on both sides. Generally, it's considered to be like a good thing. It's a mark of your social standing, a mark of your ability to buy into the system that everybody is participating into, and it just generally endears you to individuals more who are within the system. So it just becomes very, I guess, important. And Marx is actually bragging about it to someone, and that person gets jealous or envious, as Marx says, and Marx decides never to talk to him again. So definitely some interesting developments this week. I'm really looking forward to getting through the rest of this book and talking about it with you guys. We'll be back to talk about this more next week. I'm looking forward to it. Until then, enjoy the rest of September. Happy first day of fall. That was a couple days ago. Hopefully the weather levels out and we get maybe a little bit of rain and no more fires and things start to get a little bit more normal. That would be really great. I think we're all ready for things to go back at least a little bit to normal. So stay safe out there. Make sure you're wearing your masks out in public so we can all contribute to getting back to, quote unquote, the new normal. So thanks for listening, guys. If you like the podcast, give us a like, a subscribe, leave a review, follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Check out some of GSMC's other podcasts. Again, this was the Sci-Fi Podcast. My name is Keith, and I will talk to you all next week.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.